Hi, welcome to another episode of Dirk and Swap Conversations on Open Source. And once again, we have with us today Dirk Hohndel, VP and Chief Open Source Officer at VMware. Dirk, today's topic is contribution to open source. I think most people think that code is the only way you can contribute to open source, but I don't think that is true. And that's where we will be discussing. But before I kind of go in there, I would like to start with that why should we even bother with contributing to open source projects that we use or consume?
Well, so it's interesting. If you look at a traditional software package, if you look at a SaaS software as a service that you use, typically you use this in a sense of somebody else does it, and I just use it, and it's all good, and I don't need to think about it. And with open source, that is a mentality that is possible. And in certain spaces, it's a mentality that's very reasonable. So if you get exactly what you need from an open source project or from a company that sells you a commercialized version with the right level of support, with the features, with the integration. So if this all works for you, then this is a reasonable assumption. Especially if this is not really the part of your software stack where your value creation happens. So if we are talking about infrastructure components that are part of your software stack, then treating them as a black box and just using them may be a very reasonable approach. But what very often happens with open source components is that as you use them, you suddenly start seeing things that you would like to be different. Oh, there is this problem in this integration. There is a mistake in the translation of the user interface. There is this other component that I work with, and there is a problem between of them. Here's a bug that I found. And the moment you start that process, so the first time you find and report a bug, oh, you're already contributing. So to come back to your question, can you only contribute by writing code? Of course not. Any interaction with the developer team is a contribution. And even just reporting a bug or an enhancement request is a contribution. So I think it's really important to realize that the moment you want to do more than just use it as is, use it as you get it, that is the moment where, in fact, you are deciding to contribute in some way, shape, or form.
If you look at the natural way you engage with open source, no matter what, as you rightly mentioned, bug fixes, some improvements, some enhancements, they will be there. That's the whole point. You guys see the code, you will go in there and make. And what will you do? Either you could keep it locally, and that's, as we discussed earlier also, at one point you will create your own local fork, and then after a few releases, it will become painful to integrate with the upstream. So I feel that it is natural that if you're using any open source, you will engage with code at some point.
Well, I think you're actually going too far there. I think there are a lot of people who will use open source projects and who either don't have the skill or the time or the resources to write code. So I don't think that is the unavoidable path that you're taking. But what I tried to say earlier is really just submitting an enhancement request, just submitting a bug request, a bugs report, just going in and saying, oh, we could improve the documentation because you're not talking about, this scenario. Adding a translation, fixing a translation. Very often open source projects, the localizations are done by volunteers, and there aren't always native speakers of the target language. So it's a very easy way to contribute to a project that you use if you use it in a different language than the original language to help with the translation. There are so many ways to engage that don't require writing code. Of course, once you do actually make changes, and even if it's just changes to the build script, it's a different way to link against the library, it's something very basic. The moment you make such changes, the moment you fix something locally, I talked about translation, the moment you fix that locally, you have now created a snowflake. You have created something that is unique, that is not what everyone else uses, but that is your version. And this is where this desire that I talk so much about of contributing back to the project in a patch, in form of code, even if even a text change is in this sense code. That's where this desire to contribute back really becomes important, because having a snowflake, having something that is unique to your environment, does create a significant long-term cost and risks. And that is something that I think a lot of companies are willfully ignoring. And we talk a lot about this concept of technical debt, where a company has their own version of a library and they're super happy, and then they say, oh, I fixed this big bug, or oh, I have this very specific integration into my backend system, or whatever it is. And the moment they do that, now when the next version comes out of the upstream project, they need to port their fix, their change. And the more you do that, the more your own version diverges from upstream, the harder it becomes to do that. And in general, that, again, a lot of companies say, that's fine. I mean, I don't need to be on the very latest version. But then you have the zero-day security exploit, and you need to fix it now. Not in 2 weeks, not when your engineers have had time to backport the changes, today, because it's an exploit that is remote accessible. And that's when you suddenly realize, oops, I have a problem, because I have now disconnected myself from what upstream is doing. And that's where the problems come in. And that's why I say, hey, if you make local changes, your first instinct should be to contribute them back to the project.
What I was saying was that it was less about that we asked them to contribute. What I was thinking about, and I mean, I have personally not done any code writing, but what I feel is that, and when I listened to Linus or Greg, and they said, we need a lot of selfish users. So what I feel is that when you are using open source, by design, the code is open to you. So you will see things, problems that you may want to fix. And documentation is a very good example where your team may be in Europe, in India, in Asia, different parts, and you just want them to be able to use that. So the things that you're doing may be purely for your own selfish reason. It's not that you want to give something. So you might, it's like in open source, mostly we look at scratch your own itch, but scratching your own itch can become a contribution as well. So let's just talk about, you mentioned already, you alluded to a lot of things, but I used to call it C's, currency, code, communication. So there are so many ways. You mentioned documentation. So what are the ways where companies can, because you're absolutely right that not everybody may have all the developer resources that they can donate or contribute outside. So what are the other ways where companies can successfully contribute, and that contribution is recognized, because everybody wants recognition also that, hey, you know what, we are contributing to that XYZ open source project.
So I think what you mentioned with scratching your own itch is how almost everyone starts. Whether it's how a company starts engaging, whether it's how an individual starts engaging. If I look at my personal history, why did I start working on Linux almost 30 years ago? Because it didn't run on my PC. And so I tried to fix that. And I bought a new hardware card and it wasn't supported. So I helped write a driver for it. So this concept of scratching your own itch is very much at the core of where most contributions to open source start. But your question is actually a good one, because I kind of glossed over this in my first answer, all the different ways in which you contribute. And I think it deserves drilling down a little more on what does contribution actually mean? And most people think of this in the terms, well, I can give money, what you say currency, absolutely. I can give code, so I can help write the code that makes this open source project, or that integrates this open source project. Or the third thing a lot of people think about is translation or documentation. Both things that I mentioned, and both things that are very obviously areas to integrate. But there's a lot more that is going on in open source projects. So one of the fundamental questions that open source projects often ask is, what is the user story? So what are the use cases that we need to understand and that we need to cover in this project? So help setting the roadmap, help understanding how the project is actually used in real life. That's a big part of contribution. But also, once you have that settled, creating a design process. So providing input on the user interface, on the layout, on the iconography, on favorite topic of color choices, right? Understanding, making sure that the software is usable to people with disabilities, that colorblind people, blind people, people with other disabilities can actually use and benefit from your software. There are so many aspects in this user story where the development teams can benefit from contributions from users that go far beyond just currency and code and documentation. And then if you take it a level further and you look at how do these projects grow? How do these projects attract more users, more developers? How do they stay healthy? And we talked about this a lot, about the life cycle of projects and how important it is that they have a healthy developer community. So there is a certain marketing angle to this. Talking about the projects, being a reference, acknowledging that you use this open source project in your internal IT, in your products, on your website, whatever. The willingness to talk about your use and your contribution to these projects is a big part of what helps keep those projects healthy and viable. That too is a contribution. So the whole picture is so much bigger than just thinking about money and code and text.
Right. And I also feel that, when you do contribute, you also engage with the community a lot because you are so, and then what happens is that a lot of problems that you're facing, you might see a solution, like, for example, as I was talking about, just documentation is a different language altogether. When you engage, you might find people who are happy to volunteer and work with you because everybody likes to, enhance their own projects. So you might actually end up solving your own issues through someone else just by becoming an active participant in the project. So it's not just giving, you will receive a lot too.
Oh, totally. So very often when you engage in adding a new translation or in talking about a potential new feature, explaining a new use case, what happens is that you end up not being the only person with that need, and the other people with that need will likely help contribute as well, and it will become fundamentally less work for you. And this goes back to where we started a few moments ago, where doing this internally just for yourself, you're creating a snowflake, you're creating something that's different from upstream, while engaging with upstream on this, you A, get help, so it becomes easier to do, and of course, B, it becomes part of what the project delivers. And so your changes will be maintained by the project and the next update will include them. So there's a ton of benefit, not only to think about, oh, I want to make a change to scratch my own itch, but I want to make this change together with the community in public, upstream, and get the benefit of collaboration and the benefit of bringing this into the project moving forward.
What are the best approaches, to sometimes you won't even know who is the maintainer of a XYZ project. So how to get started there? What are the point of, you have been not only part of you yourself, I don't think you maintain it anymore, subsurface, or
I do.
You do. So there are, smaller projects and then there are big projects. So what is the right way to reach out to those projects so that not much get lost either in translation or it becomes a very frustrating experience? A lot of people have shared, their frustrating experience to engage with the project also.
Well, so this is actually a very, very difficult question because there are hundreds of millions of projects out there. And there is a common set of ways to do this and a set of approaches that usually work. And for all of them, there is the exception where it's different. But so in general, if you look at projects today, most of them are hosted on GitHub or have at least mirrors on GitHub. Some of the larger foundations have their own Git source of truth. So if you look at KDE has their own Git server, many others do. Some projects actually are still not in Git, which always puzzles me when I see this. But I have found that for almost every project that I want to engage with, I can at least find a mirror on GitHub or on GitLab. And so that's typically a good starting point. Now, very often the projects allow you to open an issue on GitHub. And that's a fantastic way to start the conversation, where you basically just lay out, here's the thing that I'm looking at. And you can ask the question, hey, whom should I be talking to? A lot of projects that don't have that then have either a contributing document or a README document in their root file system where they tell you where to go. Or there's a comment on GitHub that says, hey, this is just a mirror, go to invent.kde or something, So it points you to the original source where those interactions should happen. And so very typical, all it takes is you go to, you Google for the name of the project and the word Git, which gets you to either the source of truth or to a mirror. And you look at what's presented to you and just spend a couple minutes reading. And the vast majority of larger projects certainly tries to make it easy to find where to contact them. And the smaller projects typically don't actively hide that. So they give you a starting point how to connect to them. So you will see projects, for example, that say, hey, best way to reach us is to go to this user forum over there, and they may have a Google group. Or they will point you to a chat server where the developers hang out. Or they will point you to some other larger community site where the developers typically are and are listening and are looking for feedback. So it takes a few minutes of paying attention and reading. It's usually fairly easy. And what you're looking for is either a contribution document or a document that tells you how to file bugs. And those two, one of those is almost always available. And then you can follow up. And once you have someone who talks to you, it's super easy because they will point you in the right direction. But there is an implicit question in what you just asked me that is also interesting. And that is how well a project set up to actually interact with their users. And I find that super fascinating that there are some fairly significant projects that seem to have a really hard time to engage with their users or to even engage with people who want to contribute code. Sometimes it's because they have very onerous rules about code contributions, like, oh, you need to have a corporate CLA with a copyright assignment signed by, the principal of the high school you went to. Sometimes it feels that silly. And sometimes the documents are super confusing. I just recently dealt with a project that said in its contribution document at the top, we refuse all contributions from companies. Only individuals can contribute. And 3 paragraphs later, it said, an individual contributing to this project needs to bring a corporate CLA from their employer. Well, which one is it? Exactly. So you will run into situations where the projects themselves aren't doing a great job in making it easy to get started. But almost always, that's just the starting, that first hurdle, that getting it going. And once you are past that hurdle, I have yet to engage with a project where the developers weren't thrilled to engage and to talk to people who want to help.
Are there any common courtesies that the way you interact, because you can be very, very demanding also. And I have seen a lot of frictions where I've seen that I was working with, I don't want to name the project, but they were like, hey, let's also, as much as we want new contributors, we also want to tell what are the things you should not do when you're reaching out to a project, so that it doesn't look like you're demanding something. Or so is there any common courtesy also when you reach out to a project, because that you're not meeting somebody face to face in a hallway track at an event, you are sending a mail, and text tend to have a tendency of not expressing the emotions, which can be good at sometimes. But let's talk about that as well, because communication can be challenging.
Yes. So as you noticed when I described how I usually approach this, I said, read, pay attention, look at what's there. And And typically when I engage with a new project, the first thing I do is I read the last 20 issues. I look if there's a mailing list, and I read the last couple of weeks of posts on that mailing list, or if there was an IRC channel or a chat or a Slack or whatever. Read, see how people are interacting. What's the tone of voice? Is it super formal? Is it very informal? What is the relationship that they typically have with contributors? Do they have hard rules of what they require when you submit something? For example, if the bug form, the issue form on the website says, please fill out the following information, version, operating system, blah, whatever. It is a really good idea to actually fill those out, because otherwise the first response you get back is, well, why didn't you fill that out? And you're starting off on the wrong foot. So try to pay attention to how the community works and spend a few minutes on understanding the expectations. But also understand that this thing that is super important to you, that you really need to get fixed, is most likely not super important to the maintainer on the other side. So in order to get them to spend effort, spend time on this question, it makes a ton of sense to try to motivate why this is important to you. And if you can do it, offer your help and make sure that they understand you're not say, hey, I need you to fix this bug, but instead, hey, I found this bug. How can I help to make sure it gets fixed? Tone plays a huge role. And the more you come in with a condescending, demanding, you have to do this thing kind of tone, the less likely the people on the other end, they're all humans, right? The less likely the people on the other end are to say, oh, I want to help this person. Isn't that person nice? Because rule of thumb, if you yell at me, I am less inclined to help you.
Right. I was just watching Star Trek Deep Space Nine, and where I don't know if you're a Star Trek fan or not, but okay. So there was a funny, because there were Cardassians are there, so they saved them, and there was a kind of, this will be off camera, but I just want to share it. It's funny that they saved them, and Cardassians are known to be arrogant. So the captain had a bet with her first officer that. And as soon as Cardassian came, and the first officer said, hey, you lost the bet. So Cardassian asked, what happened? He said that we bet that, as soon as you come here, you will thank us later that we saved your life. The first thing is you will start complaining that why are the people following me?
Captain, would you kindly inform the security guard that he does not have to monitor my every move? It makes me feel unwelcome.
Looks like I won, Benjamin. You owe me dinner.
And what is that supposed to mean?
Captain Cisco bet me that you would thank him for the rescue before you started complaining.
I lost.
So the point is that when you approach a project, do not say, hey, I have been using your project and I cannot do this. It crashed yesterday. Don't start with a complaint. Be nice. Be thankful that, that project helped you in doing that. Because as you rightly said, not only is that developers, how you approach them, but why should they be interested in somebody who is, they also have to look at, I think, that a potential community member there. So what kind of community member are you? Are you a toxic and hostile community member, a topic that we discussed earlier, or you are something going to add value to this community? So no matter what it is always good to be nice, compliment the project that you're using. Because a lot of people, not everybody is doing it for commercial reason. A lot of people, they are doing just subsurface is a very good example. You are doing just, as a hobby, and you just want to share with other people who are also into diving. So it's nice to be nice to each other too, I feel.
I think this is almost a bigger conversation than just engaging with open source projects. This whole sentiment that there's a human being on the other end, and you should treat human beings with respect, and you should, there's the golden rule: treat people the way you want to be treated, right? So the whole approach of how you present your issue, you present your question, you present your request will immediately reflect on how it is being perceived and how people respond to it. And you just said that, that you implied that there was a difference whether it's a commercial project run by a company versus a hobby project. I actually disagree with that. So just recently in a VMware project, we had a person post on GitHub language to the effect that you should shoot one VMware engineer per day until they fix his problem. That is not appropriate. We got the person banned from GitHub, but the thought process that this would be something that you could say just because it's a company behind that project, it is still an open source project. It still is based on a level of conduct that should be respectful to the humans involved, and that should show that you realize that you are getting something for free and that you're engaging with the community, that you're not paying for a product with an SLA behind it, and that changes the rules of engagement. And so to me, this, what I typically call basic human decency and how we deal with each other, is something that way too often gets lost. And I have many incidences where people approach me in the context of open source projects that I'm involved in manners that I just find offensive and off-putting, and that is guaranteed to reduce the likelihood that I want to engage with you.
No, we talked about that last time. The toxic people, those people are loud, and there's nothing we can do about that. And it's not just about corporate project. Those people will be everywhere. I find that sometimes when we are who we are in person, that changes the moment we move to online. But online, I mean, if you look at car, road rage, the same person who would be nice to you in person in a store suddenly will be honking and, trying to take over. So I think the moment people kind of are not interacting in a very, very impersonal, they I don't know whether they stop being themselves or they actually become themselves who they are, because then they are in a safe bubble. It could be their car or their computer, and there is nothing we can do about those people except for not engaging with them, as we discussed last time. So that is there. But the bottom line is, it doesn't matter whether it's open source project or if it's a Microsoft product that you're buying. It doesn't hurt to be nice to, I mean, whenever I make support calls, for whatever reasons, it doesn't, if you're nice to them, even if you're flying, you have paid for a heavy ticket. If you're nice to the flight attendants, you will get a better service. Just because you bought an expensive ticket doesn't mean you will be a rude person. So that applies everywhere in a civilized world.
It does. And what scares me the most is if I meet some of these super rude online people and they turn out to be super rude in person. But the where we came from in this conversation is not being on a soapbox and telling people how to behave, but it's the question of how are you successful when engaging with the project. So you have a problem you want solved, either a bug or you want to contribute or whatever it is. So you have an intended outcome of this interaction. You have a desired result. And if you go into such an interaction and you paid a lot of money, then you may be able to come in and make demands. If you come in and engage with an open source project where the interaction is all about trust and relationships and humans doing things with each other, then how you interact, how you approach the conversation has a massive impact on the likelihood of success. And that's really what I was talking about. I was talking about how can you increase the likelihood of having a good experience and of having your problem solved or being able to solve your problem with the people in the project. And the more you behave like a decent human being, the better the likelihood of this happening.
I also want to talk about companies or corporations. How should they encourage their employees, the companies who are, engaging with open source, that they also become, active contributor participants of the project that the company, because companies cannot set rules, hey, you have to go and contribute to the project. You are engaging with a project. So how do they inspire them? How do they motivate them? How they add incentives so that their employees, of course, they can work in their daytime, but also become active participants, because that's also reflect on their own kind of positioning in the community as well.
Completely true. So being active in these communities, being as active supporter, contributor to projects tends to reflect well on companies. And companies typically have this self-interest first mentality. And so when I want to talk to company executives about why this is a good thing to do, it's of course all about the technical debt, about the cost of not doing it. So if you create your own snowflake, or if you have a project that fails in a critical part of your value chain and doesn't integrate into your software stack, there is a significant cost associated with this. And so from a company perspective, the engagement makes sense. And now the motivation of the individual engineer or tech writer or a design artist or whatever your role may be can come down to two things. One is the company can make it part of your job. The company can say, this is part of your deliverables, which is a great way to do it if that is how you want to structure the relationships, that you simply assign tasks. And the other option that you have is to create an environment where this is encouraged and where people are rewarded for their contributions upstream. So when the annual performance review comes around, the impact that people have had in open source projects is part of how their overall value to the company is assessed. And by actively communicating this and making sure people understand that this is how they're being evaluated, you can clearly create an environment where contributions upstream are something that the employees want to do. Now, but if you turn this around, one other thing that I wanted to mention is a lot of companies actually have rule sets around contributions upstream. There is very often an approval process. So you need to make sure that you aren't in a conflict of interest, that you aren't potentially leaking internal IP. So most companies have a sometimes very complicated, often hopefully fairly smooth and simple process to register your interest of engaging in a project. And many companies have codes of conduct that they overlay with the code of conduct in the community. So because if you are showing up as a representative of the company, your actions reflect on the company. So it's always a good idea to ensure that you understand what are the requirements that your company puts on you as you engage with a project. Now, today, 2021, I feel that most companies predominantly are encouraging interactions in these projects. I still run into the occasional very, very old-fashioned company that is hostile to this idea. But compared to 10 years ago, they are extremely rare these days. So talk to your legal team, if you have your open source program office, and make sure you understand what the expectations are.
I also talk to a lot of companies, and most companies, nowadays, especially the companies who were like traditional proprietary companies, they are the most flexible ones. Though one thing that they do is that the kind of license that is being used in the project, because then you might expose your own IP in a license. So it's very good idea. But most companies, as you said, they have very good framework in place. So you don't have to go through the hoops and loops of HR and lawyers. There are already check marks that you can do that and very easily. Because the thing is, you don't have a week to submit a patch sometimes. So they are trying to cut down on paperwork and automate as much as they can, because they do understand by now what is there. Dirk, thank you so much for once again taking time out today and talk about this. Is a very important discussion, because without contribution, there is no such thing as open source. You can put your code out there, but without contributors, not a code that people can use and contribute back. So thanks for this discussion, and I look forward to talk to you again. So thank you.
Thanks, Bob.